It's time to get sexy on Secular Sexuality.
Hello, and welcome to a very special episode of Secular Sexuality, the show that's working to bring sexy back to the Atheist Community of Austin. Joining me in a very special interview today is Dr. Eric Sprankle, Associate Professor of Clinical Psychology and Sexual Studies at Minnesota State University. He's a licensed clinical psychologist with the Secular Therapy Project and ASEC Certified Sex Therapist with the Minnesota Sexual Health Institute. Most importantly, you know him from Instagram and Twitter as @Dr. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can say that you definitely came to my attention. I'm really not even on Twitter, but so many of the observations, the kind of pointed things that you've said have just been screen captured and gotten out into the zeitgeist. And so I was really shocked and surprised and delighted, I suppose, when you messaged me back and were willing to come and join us. So thanks so much for being here again for the audience and having this conversation.
Of course. Thank you.
Yeah. So we wanted to talk a little bit about just sort of the nature of spirituality. I mean, here doing secular sexuality, we are always kind of confronted with this issue, this conflict between our spiritual selves, whatever that even means in a post-religious, awkward Judeo-Christian culture that we all sort of exist in, while also recognizing that even though it's, on sale and on display at every single grocery store, and sexuality is a huge part of our lives, everybody around here seems to be kind of cranky and frustrated by it. So in sorting through all of that out, you pointed out that sexuality and spirituality are somewhat incompatible. And so tonight we're going to be diving into that and having kind of a conversation about what all of these things mean, what we should be doing about them. And to start off with, I guess I just kind of wanted to define our terms and understand a little bit more about what we're talking about. So when we say spirituality, I mean, we did an episode just a couple of weeks ago where we really tried to put some definitions on some of these things and lock some of these things down, but they're incredibly squirrely. So when we're talking about spirituality, what does that even look like, or what are we referring to?
I have no idea. And that's the problem, right?
Uh-huh.
And so normally when I critique spirituality and say that it's incompatible with sexuality, I'm viewing spirituality through kind of the dominant Christian lens in the United States. And so from that definition, it focuses on like an essence of ourselves that transcends our physical selves. It's our spirit or soul that's more similar to God than our fleshly bodies. And I know there are post-Christian or New Age definitions and even atheistic definitions. Like Sam Harris wrote an entire book on the topic. Mm-hmm. But it's the religious definition that I speak about as being incompatible with sex positivity.
Yeah, absolutely. So this show itself was sort of founded, as we've discussed recently on air, on the aftermath of Dr. Darrell Ray publishing Sex and God, as well as the God virus, and just sort of that understanding of the impact of spirituality, or particularly like Christian and Western religious thought on our sexuality. So when we're looking at that discordance and that, I guess, disconnection, you are really referring to like a larger religious sense rather than, I don't know, some existential or personal meditative type of comprehension. It's very materialist or anti-materialist, I guess.
Right. Yeah, I would say 99% of my criticism of spirituality is spirituality how I think the majority of Americans think of it, and it is synonymous with, or at least tied into and working within the framework of Christianity. But that's not to say that I don't have issue with New Age definitions and conceptualizations or even atheistic conceptualizations of spirituality, but the bulk of my critique is focused on that kind of the relationship between spirituality and religious belief, and then how that impacts our culture.
Yeah. So if we look at sexuality as everything from gender to romance to, the actual act of sex, whether that's procreative or everything else, is there anything that I might be missing or that we need to make sure to include in that understanding?
No, I mean, I've just always been a big advocate for defining sexuality in the broadest terms.
Sure.
I think the general population just equates sexuality with sexual behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And sexual behavior obviously is certainly a part of sexuality, but it's a lot more. Everything that you were saying, just from like a psychological perspective, I'm interested in sexuality being relating to someone's thoughts, feelings, behaviors, as well as identities. So trying to keep the definition of sexuality as broad as possible. And I don't think that's incompatible with just viewing sexuality as sexual behavior, because that is a slice of it. And where I see, or at least where I argue, that there's some problems with defining spirituality, even from a materialist perspective or an atheistic perspective, that you can't make that same argument, in the sense that for a lot of folks, and I would say the majority of folks in our culture, spirituality does have that immaterial essence to it, that spirit, that soul, what gets us closer to God. And if I were to define spirituality and actually advocate how it can be incorporated into our sexuality, it would not include that component at all. So that has to be completely dismissed in order for, at least in my opinion, for us to reconcile spirituality and sexuality.
Yeah, so if we were to create a definition of spirituality, just sort of ad hoc, that was sort of just a conglomeration of neurons, memories, however we want to actually define the material aspects of our thinking processes, that would not necessarily be incompatible with sexuality. That's something really outside of the discussion that we're having. If your consciousness is just a bundle of memories or thought processes, and thoughts being defined as, the accumulation of neurotransmitters working throughout the brain to the best of our understanding of them, that's not necessarily at issue here.
Right. For the most part, it depends on a person's spiritual practice, then, of what they are trying to tap into, like this level of consciousness or this self-transcendence. Seeking, at least, for a brief moment, through contemplative practices, meditation, substance use, whatever kind of gets you into that self-transcendence kind of mindset, as just a nice little break from the immediate reality of your surroundings, a nice break from the constant drive and hunger that we have as living organisms. The only thing I would be cautious of, and how that can still be sex negative, is like, are we pathologizing these natural drives, which includes sexuality? Do we feel like this is a burden that we need to take a break from? And again, that's fine. We can take a break, put it on a shelf for a little bit at a time to have a nice breather from anything. But is it really kind of being driven, ironically, to kind of get rid of or like overcome some of these human drives that we have, including sexuality? So that would still be one problem that I would have, even with the materialist definition of spirituality. And then just a second one is just, and I think just more of a broader issue with this, is I just think the word spirituality is tainted in our language, in our culture. I think it's going to be very, very difficult to separate it from a religious understanding of what spirituality is. And so that's always going to come to mind, I think. And I think we would be better served by just using another term or creating a new term that is more reflective of a materialist kind of self-transcendence experience.
Yeah, so I definitely hear that, wanting to, even terms like consciousness or these other ideas really kind of can border into that sort of woo space and be really tricky and difficult to work with. We spent, like I said, an entire hour and a half trying to tackle some of these issues and wrap our minds around them. But just moving forward, I guess my question then becomes, is sexuality is any understanding of, whether we're calling it meditation, whether we're talking about just taking a mental break from things, anything tied to our existence as humans or our sense of consciousness, that with our sexuality, are they necessary components of a healthy, well-balanced life? I mean, are you able to be a happy, healthy, successful person without, window gazing or navel contemplating?
Right. So I think the issue is less about whether or not those components exist in our life, because I think even if they're just artificial constructs of like what is spirituality, well, this is how we define it in our culture, and this is how we're defining sexuality. Like those components exist for everybody. They're a part of our culture in the U.S. and obviously elsewhere, but I speak primarily from a U.S. perspective. So it's not about whether or not they exist and whether that's good or bad. My issue, especially from a psychological perspective, would be how well those things align with our thoughts and feelings and our values, right? And so do our sexual behaviors align with our sexual attitudes, our beliefs, and our sexual values? How about with spirituality, how we think about that, what we believe in that? Does that align with how we're behaving in a spiritual or non-spiritual way? These are the things that can create distress if there's not alignment between that. Going back to Psych 101 term of like cognitive dissonance, where beliefs don't match up with behaviors, and that creates distress. And so then you're left with, well, do I change my belief system or do I change my behaviors in order to make these things more congruent? And so I think for me that's how I view it. It's less about whether these components are necessary or not. I think they exist. We can't avoid them. But let's try to make sure that we're taking inventory of ourselves to make sure that our thoughts, feelings, values are aligned with our behaviors.
Yeah, rather than, like in the case of organized religion, importing whole cloth a set of values and beliefs and social and political understandings and all of these things, and then just trying to graft them onto our brains and expecting our minds and our bodies and our values to suddenly line up with a list of presets that were, generated in a totally different time, in a totally different place, for a very different worldview.
Right, that's definitely a recipe for disaster. I'm really interested in research that's coming out of Bowling Green State University in Ohio. A professor there, Josh Grubbs, he does a lot of research in the area of moral incongruence, which is essentially what I was explaining with cognitive dissonance. But he's applying that theory specifically to folks who are either self or other labeling as sex addicts or porn addicts. So when is pornography problematic for somebody? When do they think that they have a sex or a porn addiction? And this conceptual framework that Professor Grubbs is working with is saying that it's really has little to do with the amount that somebody is engaging in sexual behavior, whether alone or with other people. It's whether or not that specific sexual behavior is incongruent with their sexual values, largely influenced by their religious values. So what the data is showing from his research is, certainly just going to paraphrase it briefly, is that if you have these very restrictive religious values that are prohibitive of a lot of different sexual behaviors, essentially anything outside of, penile vaginal intercourse with your spouse for the purpose of procreation with the lights off and people pray afterwards. Anything that deviates from that, including masturbating while watching pornography, they're going to feel distressed by that. And so even if they watch pornography and masturbate once a month, because it violates their sexual values dictated by their religion, that creates a moral incongruence, and they have a lot of distress over that, and they think they're a sex addict, and then they seek therapy for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've seen a number of data sets that point out that the folks who feel like they're struggling with these types of addictions or self-labeled addicts are consuming at basically the same rate or less than their other compatriots who are doing just fine. I mean, I even see that in my therapy office when somebody comes in talking about how they're masturbating 2, even 3 times a day, and it's an afternoon meeting, and I'm like, okay, only 2 or 3 today. So I definitely hear that. I guess the question then becomes, in what ways do we get around spirituality, since it is so, I guess, pervasive? I mean, even if we're not actively going to church or whatever else, I mean, these ideas are part of our families. They're part of the TV we watch, the people we hang out with. I mean, just everywhere.
Yeah, and I think this is definitely a problem for everyone, but atheists and other non-believers aren't immune to this
Hmm.
because we can intellectualize as atheists saying that, oh yeah, I'm not going to listen to anything that's coming out of the Vatican. It's archaic, it's patriarchal, it's homophobic. And so I'm not going to base my sexual values off of what the Pope is saying. And if they are saying something very prohibitive, I can dismiss that as ridiculous and unnecessary and arbitrary oppression. However, that doesn't change how we feel
Hmm.
about engaging in certain sexual behaviors, about having certain sexual identities, because we've been bombarded with these messages from day one. And even if we intellectually disagree with them, and whether or not we came to that conclusion 20 years ago or just like 20 minutes ago, we can still have that emotional impact still that this is wrong in some way, right? Because the religious communities are saying it's wrong, and just society in general, which is a reflection of our religious values, is also saying it's wrong. And so anytime that we're experiencing a stigmatized characteristic, again, whether that's behavior or identity, stigma is going to lead to distress, and
Hmm.
that needs to be dealt with emotionally and psychologically, and oftentimes through professional means by seeking counseling or therapy.
Yeah, so that's definitely a significant value as a therapist. Just this idea that in order for something to be a problem, it has to cause an issue.
Mhm.
There has to be distress present in order for something to actually matter in a clinical sense or to want to
Right.
change it. That being said, though, what are sort of the symptoms or the red flags or just the hallmarks of these experiences that people should be, I guess, not hyper vigilant of, but aware of in their own thinking and in their own lives? What does distress look
Yeah, I
like?
would say, sure. I would say that the big ones would just be, identifying feelings of sexual shame, sexual guilt, sexual embarrassment. Are you engaging in stigma management strategies? So if you do have a stigmatized identity or engage in a stigmatized behavior, let's say like unconventional sexual behavior like BDSM or kink, um, how much of that stigma are you managing, and what kind of impact is that having on your life? And so examples with stigma management would be identity concealment, that you're not out, whether it's an identity or behavior, to those in your social network,
Mhm.
regardless of how close they are. And we know that the more that we engage in identity concealment, the more isolated that we feel, and that decreases our psychological well-being. So we need to just kind of tune into ourselves. Are we feeling guilty about this? Are we feeling shame? Do we feel embarrassment? Are we engaging in some of these stigma management practices, like identity concealment? And if so, that can be certainly a flag that something's a little bit off in terms of our thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and values with our behavior. And is this related to how society, and in particular religion, is kind of treating our sexual selves?
Mhm. So if we recognize that, I guess the sex addiction model, or some of these other more top down liturgical, like the church coming in and saying this is right and this is wrong, and if we acknowledge that all of these different perspectives are kind of weak or failing in helping us to actually address our sexuality, what is the next step for somebody who is struggling with that type of shame, that guilt that can't just be dispelled by dismissing it or saying, "Oh, well, I can ignore the Vatican. Oh, I can ignore, my racist neighbor." Nevertheless, these thoughts are still getting in. So what do we do about them on a personal level?
Yeah, it just depends on how much disruption they are causing in our life. Looking at it, from a clinical psych perspective, that level of distress, that impairment in functioning, and if it's not getting to that high level of clinical distress or interference with functioning, then that would warrant seeking out. A sex positive counselor or therapist, and one that is competent in working with the secular population. Then it would be seeking out support networks. I'm assuming most of your viewers for this show did that very exact same thing, whether that was very intentional
Mhm.
seeking or not. We are seeking like-minded individuals where we feel validated, where we feel supported, where we don't feel as isolated, where we can let our guards down a little bit, not engage in as many stigma management behaviors as we do with outsiders where we don't really trust that we could be judged, we could be discriminated against, or even experience acts of violence. So seeking out those communities, whether they are in person or online, I think are going to be great strategies to feeling not as alone and feeling validated and supported.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that was definitely a big part of my story, was just shows like this. I mean, in particular, I've mentioned on air a number of times things like Dan Savage's Savage Lovecast and the Multi-Amory podcast and these different things, just because witnessing a healthy relationship with sexuality in others and kind of talking through all of these issues. I mean, you can intellectually have somebody explain to you the reality of a transgender identity and what that might mean in 2019 America, but until you actually are interacting with those ideas and figuring out the complications of what it might mean to go on a road trip in the rural South, or what it might look like to have an interaction at a party or something along those lines, that's when you begin to start to feel comfortable with those ideas, because you've actually sort of test-driven them, even if it's just in an intellectual capacity, by listening to some of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to inoculate yourself essentially to these new experiences. I like to think of it as like scaffolding, taking baby steps. And that's why, just yesterday I was talking with somebody about how they are managing a stigmatized identity, having problems with their partners, family, being very religiously conservative and not accepting of who they are. And how is that, possible to manage? And there's not, a one kind of solution to that. And so my feedback to this person, which I've shared to everybody too, would just be what feels authentic to you while balancing a sense of safety and security. Mm-hmm. So I can't tell you to be like, yeah, be 100% out, be 100% authentic with whatever identity or behavior that is stigmatized, because that could have very, very serious negative consequences for that person. So they have to learn how to kind of read the room and challenge themselves a little bit of kind of how much do I want to kind of conform and fit in, engage in stigma management, versus how much can I actually show my authentic self. And that's going to change depending on the scenarios that you're in, the situations that you're in, who you're speaking with or around, as well as that will change with time. And if you are like scaffolding and slowly inoculating yourself to some of these experiences, you are over time going to be able to live more authentically, or just have better self-selection of who you're surrounding yourself with. That your social network is now 100% of folks that you can be authentic around and not engage in any stigma management practices.
Yeah, and we would all love to live in a world where code switching wasn't necessary and people were able to just be more genuine and be themselves. But the reality is there can be a considerable amount of danger. I mean, less so in the United States, but we are certainly not without a lot of risk for a lot of particular populations. Right. But even still, I guess I feel like an aspect of all of this, particularly for somebody who's coming from a fairly vanilla, straight, cisgendered type of orientation, they can be wanting to be accepting, wanting to be open-minded, intellectually comfortable with these things, but still feel kind of viscerally complicated or upset. I mean, and it's very difficult for me to explain to somebody that, even as a self-labeled sex therapist or whatever else, there are things that make me gag, and I don't necessarily, judge those things. Like, I mean, honestly, I think the ability to perform an open heart surgery is an incredibly noble, remarkable skill, and I have nothing but like positive sentiments towards that aspect of science. That doesn't mean that watching one wouldn't make me pass out.
Right.
And so, when we talk about, sounding or rainbow showers or these different things, there's not a sense of judgment, and yet people often kind of conflate, I think, sort of their natural, visceral reactions to other people's sexuality or even to their own sexuality with, I think, a sense of morality.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the old saying, like, don't yuck my yum. Mm-hmm. And when I'm either teaching just like a group of undergrads, in my sexual health class, or I'm doing a training for therapists on becoming more confident in addressing sexuality issues, that's one thing that I think that gets very misunderstood, that in order to be sex positive, you have to be open to everything, like personally. It's like, no, not at all. And I intentionally expose them, at least in my class and a little bit in these trainings too, to images that are supposed to be a little bit shocking, a little bit disturbing, a little bit disgusting, I would say, for the majority of individuals. And just to kind of get that reaction, that gut reaction out of them. And so then what do they do with that then? Do they want to say then to that other person, you shouldn't be doing this, this is unhealthy, this is wrong, this is immoral, this is a sin? Or can they just like really be self-reflective and being like, you know what, this isn't for me, but if somebody else is really into this, all right. That's sex positivity. It's not being able to be open to every type of sexual experience for yourself, but it's knowing oneself, knowing your boundaries, your limits, your values, making sure that they're congruent with your behavior, and respecting others are going to be different than that.
Yeah, and I feel like in so many other aspects of our sexuality, I mean, when it comes to things like orientation, you know, people are comfortable with identifying who they'd be interested in having sex with and are generally willing to accept that somebody else might have a different perspective. And yet when it comes particularly to kinks and things like that, that seems to go out the window for some reason. And in particular, when I have been in debates and things with theists, I feel like sort of the natural order of things is something that gets referenced a lot. This idea that, you know, if it makes you feel upset, if it makes you feel sick, it is naturally wrong, and when, you know, God put that into our hearts and we should know that. And I guess I'm confused as to why that message is so pervasive when it's so, you know, readily dismissed.
Yeah, I think that's just kind of a lazy intellectual argument to oppress others, right? That this is icky, so this must be against natural law. God doesn't want us to do this, so you shouldn't do this, and it's punishable if you do. That holds like zero intellectual weight. But it's an easy thing, I think, for people not to think very critically about and to support kind of blindly, because they feel that and they know what that's like to see something that's really off-putting to them, disturbing, offensive, or disgusting, and be like, yeah, there has to be something wrong with this. And like what I was saying, like what I do in some of these exercises in my classes is to invoke that response. I'm expecting people to have that response and then have them sit with that and to kind of really process and to think, okay, what does this say about me? And what can this mean for somebody else? And to really respect that just because I'm feeling a certain way doesn't mean that somebody else is feeling a certain way. And why should my feelings dictate the behavior of others? Yeah, I lost my train of thought. I was going to say something else with that, but that thought is now gone in some immaterial consciousness.
Yeah, well, fair enough. I guess the question then becomes, you know, as we're moving forward as a society, at least, you know, as a humanist, I'd like to believe that we are. And I see things like the way that, you know, Captain Kirk kissing Uhura in the 60s and sort of the reaction that that got versus, you know, 30 years later you have Ellen on the air and then Will and Grace and then Modern Family sort of inoculating our society in the way that you described. Is there an end game for that process? And does it include sex positivity that extends to some of these, you know, more extreme kinks? Will we ever get to a point, and I certainly don't mean to inflate kinky sex with interracial relationships or with same-sex relationships or anything along those lines, but as we become more sex positive and increasingly less, I guess, upset as a society about these sorts of things, are we getting to a point where a, you know, particularly rare kink is going to be more generally accepted at some point in the future?
Yeah, I mean, if I want to be an optimist about it, yeah, I think we will eventually get there. If our species doesn't die off first, but I think we will progress ultimately in that, to have that outcome. I mean, we'll have some setbacks here or there. But I think we will get there eventually into like this fully like sexually liberated state. And that's largely where I see my role, just like my philosophy of kind of advocating for sex positivity, is to steer it as far as possible to the left. To be radical with sexual liberation. And if you want to like examples of what radical sexual liberation looks like, I just came across this this past weekend. It's a group, kind of a collective known as Sex Militant. Jex Blackmore, she's a political Satanist, anarchist out of Detroit. They have this kind of list of pillars of what sexual liberation looks like. And that's kind of like the most radical kind of list I've ever seen. Nothing unethical on that list whatsoever, but not something that you see in kind of mainstream discourse about what sex positivity looks like. And I think that's important to steer the conversation as far left as possible, because there's going to be resistance regardless of your sexual health, sexual positivity advocacy. So why not shift that discourse a little bit further left, as opposed to taking more of a centrist sex positive kind of stance, trying to get just a little bit incorporated or liberated into our society, and where we're now debating the merits of sexual orientation and certain sexual identities just having basic human rights with the far right, that we have to compromise our values with those on the far right. I want to be driving the conversation as far left as possible, so leftists are having debates and making compromises with your run-of-the-mill liberal Democrats. That's where kind of I think a reasonable debate and compromise would be right now in 2019. We should be dismissing and not even bringing to the table the conservative, the far right arguments at all.
Well, I certainly hear in the sense that, just basic human rights are still very much intellectual think pieces and party debate type issues. I mean, because I do introduce myself as a therapist, or if pressed, a sex therapist, I really can't go to a cookout without somebody trying to explain to me why, trans women shouldn't be able to compete in athletics, or, these different complications. So I definitely hear that argument that we should be really pushing people as far as possible so that we can kind of recenter the debate around a place of genuine intellectual curiosity that is divorced from like the health and safety of members of our society.
Yeah, absolutely. I do not want, and I do not like seeing platforms that are catering to a debate whether or not somebody should have basic human rights, should they exist. You see this a lot with sex workers' rights. There's always debates of whether or not their work should be criminalized, should they be arrested for engaging in sexual behavior for some type of monetary gain. Let's not have these conversations at all. They're humans. There shouldn't be incarceration to begin with, if we want to get very leftist with it. So let's just focus on how to improve the health and well-being of workers, of marginalized populations. That's where the debate should be, not on these kind of black and white, kind of conservative and a little less conservative, whether or not somebody of a marginalized group deserves basic human rights or even deserves to exist.
Yeah, it's amazing how over the course of just a couple of minutes, we can go from acknowledging all of the progress and the things that have been made. I mean, just starting with the Stonewall riots, though, of course, it doesn't start there. All the progress of the last 50 years and these things to be excited about. Mainstream network TV having openly gay characters. But then I have to kind of remind myself, that shouldn't be remarkable. That 10% of the population is getting represented in mainstream TV should not be an achievement. I mean, certainly we're glad that it's happening. We want to see it furthered. But you're right. This should be basic stuff that we should have had figured out a long time ago. So with that being said, what are still the major holdouts that you see, the things that really have gone well past their expiration date and that you are ready to see, I guess, fall?
Pretty much every system of power. And that's going to be my leftist mentality of like, if they are currently in power, they've been in power way too long.
Sure.
So any institutionalized oppression that we have in our culture, whether that be white supremacy, Christian supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormativity, our current government, all of those things are way, way past their expiration date. So that's why I don't like left infighting. I support left unity. So whatever the tactic may be, whether they're with the democratic socialists who are trying to change the system from within and get candidates into the system to kind of change it in positions of power, or for more the anarchists or Marxist-Leninists who say like, no, you can't fix a broken system like this. It just has to be torn down and we need to start fresh. So essentially anybody that has power over us now should not. And I don't think that...
Clean sweep.
Yeah. And I think the pessimist in me was like, I don't have expectations that that's going to happen in my lifetime, but we can chisel away and we can keep the conversation going for future generations to do the work to eventually, hopefully, get to a better place.
Yeah, what does chiseling look like for, the average audience member right now? What are the things that, obviously voting with a conscience and remembering that, there are human beings behind these thought experiments and political talking points, but what else should people be doing on a daily basis to create this more sex-positive world?
Yeah, with that, it really depends on what's in that person's comfort level as well as skill set. Not everybody can engage in black bloc tactics, anarchists out on the street protesting and directly having confrontations with systems of power. There shouldn't be an expectation that all of us are going to get up and do that. But that has its place for some folks, that's in their skill set and that's in their belief system to kind of fight back. Others would take more of a democratic approach and going to the voting booth and supporting candidates and getting that word out for candidates that would be promoting sex positivity. And again, not taking compromises, be like, oh yeah, they support abortion under all these different circumstances. They're kind of hush-hush on sexual identity issues. They still want sex workers to be criminalized. It's like, no, let's not throw our weight behind those kind of candidates. Let's get those who are truly embracing sexual liberation. Others, it would just be like, are you a good writer? And then do you have outlets to get your words out there to the masses, whether it's a blog or op-eds through newspapers, whether they're mainstream or more the alternative press. It's just like, what can you do that's in your skill set as well as comfort area that can lead to this fight? Because I never say there's one right way to protest or wrong way, but as long as we're all protesting and resisting in our own unique ways, that has a lot of power combined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you yourself, I know I mentioned your Twitter feed at the top of the show, and I think it would be really lazy to just kind of seek out somebody who has like a very pithy, kind of clever, short message format as a way of changing the world. But what interested me about your work, and it just brought me to your website and everything else, is kind of the way you've responded after getting, I guess, I don't want to say targeted necessarily, but after really drawing attention to yourself and getting a lot of negative attention and criticism. Searching your name on Google brings up a number of different websites of people just going on and on about how you clearly don't understand the virgin birth and these other ridiculous things. But I guess as somebody who's been kind of on the front lines, I'm really curious what your experience has been like.
Yeah, so I think it's similar to what we were talking about earlier of inoculating ourselves, scaffolding, just becoming used to a new reality. I've been on Twitter now since I think like 2011 or something. As soon as I started this, my job at Minnesota State, I think it coordinated around my first year there. Early on, I would get a comment that was negative or critical, even if it was like kind of somewhat civil, or it was just kind of like an ad hominem attack, something personal about appearance or credentials or something. I'd be like, oh my God, this person and this random person I don't know in Massachusetts doesn't like me. That's awful. And I would get like nervous about it. This is just activating my own kind of like approval seeking schemas or whatever. But you get enough of those messages and then it's like, okay, whatever, this is just another comment. And then you wait for like something new. And then like the intensity of some of the comments and messages and emails, and like some people still like call my office and leave me a message. It's pretty archaic. I don't know who's doing that. But it happens. And then like if something, like I said, is very new, it may stir up some anxiety with me of not knowing kind of where this is going. But again, doing this for close to 8 years now, I've kind of built up a big tolerance to it. Even with aggressive messages, hostile ones of like that I should kill myself, or even direct specific death threats at me. It doesn't change my behavior. That's for sure. Nothing slows me down with that. It's just how I manage it kind of behind the scenes and emotionally for me. But how I've really conceptualized it, I think over the past year when things have really ramped up with some of the negativity coming from the far right, is that the groups that come after me the hardest and with the most aggression and kind of coordinated attacks, they're really out there. It's kind of like two groups primarily, like the QAnon folks, so like the tinfoil hat wearing kind of conspiracy theorists who think the world is run by a group of elite satanic pedophiles who are running an international sex trafficking ring funded by Jews. And then kind of like the flip side of that same ridiculous coin, you have the white nationalists who believe in the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory, in which there's groups of folks, including sex educators, who are trying to overthrow Western values. And of course, we're being funded by Jews too, so there's a lot of anti-Semitism hurled in my direction. And how I've conceptualized it and how I kind of managed it for myself, or like my own anxiety of kind of being on the receiving end of all this, is that if I'm pissing off white nationalists, that's a good thing. Like I don't want a white nationalist to see my tweet, any tweet that I make, and be like, okay, whatever. I want to be like invoking a very strong negative response from them. If not, I don't feel like I am being controversial enough for them and pushing the conversation to the left as far as I could. So I think I even made comments before of putting this in like tweet form of like, if your sex education isn't upsetting white supremacists, it's not comprehensive enough. And that's always kind of like a guiding principle for me. It's like, and that's an extremely low bar to piss off white nationalists with anything sexuality related, but we should be striving for that. And if we're not getting that, to kind of reevaluate, why am I a little too mainstream, that I'm not kind of getting this reaction from those on the far right. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily like a badge of honor, but it at least allows me to kind of calibrate where I am and making sure that I am on the right track and pissing off the right people and supporting the right people.
Yeah, I definitely hear that. I mean, I think like many of us, I am both fascinated, repulsed, and a little bit confused by the sort of the rise of white nationalism, particularly on the internet and some of the darker pieces of social media. In particular, I've always been really baffled at why these groups have so closely aligned themselves with like the No Fap movement and the Proud Boys and these ideas of getting away from pornography or really emphasizing sex addiction and things like that. I guess I've heard from you a little bit over the course of this conversation that is likely tied to these kind of archaic ideals about sexuality and about where our moralism should come from. But is there any other insight you can give me into why 4chan and Reddit and these things like so closely value this seemingly ridiculous idea about masturbation?
Yeah, a couple of things that I've gained insight into, and whether or not this is completely accurate or not, this is just kind of me looking into like, who are these folks that are coming after me? What do they have in common? What are their belief systems? Things like that. And their prohibitions around masturbation and pornography are kind of twofold. One is kind of focusing on this purity of self. And so like their ideas of white purity goes along with their purity of their sexual behavior too. It's like, and a lot of this, especially the folks that come after me, are traditionalist Catholics. I had to look, I mean, I was raised Catholic. I was an altar boy. I even didn't know what that meant. I was like, why are all these like folks who are coming after me have avatars of like Crusader Knights? Like, what is that about? And so this traditionalist Catholic, that kind of ideology, with Vatican II, with the Pope in the 60s, kind of revolutionizing Catholicism a little bit, that masses don't have to be spoken in Latin, that they can use the local language or whatever. That was too radical for these traditionalist Catholics. And so they want to go like pre-1960 Catholicism, and anything after that has been just heresy for them. And so that's kind of one group of just like really kind of controlling sexuality as a way to kind of control oneself and align with very, very strict religious values. The other one is more of a conspiracy theory on their part, kind of getting into what I was mentioning about cultural Marxism and kind of this group of elite Jews who are financing this, kind of trying to topple Western civilization and Western Christian values. They believe that Jews control, obviously, the media. That's an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that's been around forever. But within that, they also control pornography. And so they're pushing pornography on our culture as a way to degrade Western Christian values, and specifically sexual values, especially with any type of depiction of interracial porn that plays right into their white genocide conspiracy theories. So they're really kind of focused on maintaining this white, pure identity through sexual purity and controlling the sexuality of others.
Yeah, as a kid who grew up in a very conservative Christian school in a very small town with 3 different channels and, very strict monitoring of, the CDs I was buying, the movies I was watching, these different things, I'm incredibly excited to live in a world where you and I can have this conversation, and then there are teenagers who are able to watch it on their cell phones or listen to it as they're, walking down the street on a podcast and things like that. So it's an incredible time to be alive, but also everything you just described is real and happening and is a thought process that people actually believe in this modern age. It's amazing how social media has brought, I guess, maybe conspiracies just to the forefront. Maybe they've always existed, or maybe they're more visible now. I don't know what it is that's happening that feels so different.
With any type of political movement, there's going to be reactionaries, those who are trying to hold on to the status quo. And so again, kind of like how I'm viewing, if I'm getting hate messages from and like death threats from white nationalists, okay, I must be saying something that I truly believe in, that I think is good to send out there into the world if white nationalists are upset by that. So there's always going to be reactionaries. But what you were saying too about the flip side of that, of how like all of this is very positive in this interaction with social media and other types of media outlets, is that kind of that expression, I don't know who originally said it, just that nice little quotable of, and I'm just paraphrasing, of something of like, say and do the things that you needed to hear and see as a child. And so I think that goes definitely along the lines of what you were saying earlier of like, yeah, when we were growing up, I'm 37 now, so I was growing up, I was a young kid in the 80s, and then kind of later childhood and adolescence in the 90s, didn't really have too many kind of outlets that I could really connect to that wasn't heavily regulated and censored. I mean, I had the same thing. My parents were very loving. They knew they were raising a goth child since I was in diapers, and I was just kind of obsessed with Halloween and everything. So they tried to cater that to as much as possible. Got a little bit more concerned once I started having interest in like heavy metal music and the satanic imagery with all of that. But I pushed as much as I could. But I couldn't imagine growing up now and having all the opportunities to find a sense of community and belonging and have validation online and through social media. So that's the other thing that I kind of keep in mind is like, who needs to hear this? Who's that kid that's really struggling, that they feel completely isolated in the real world, but they may stumble across, like your YouTube channel and realize, oh, there are others out there like me. There is a home. It's just not where I'm currently at, but it does exist. And that can give them a sense of community. Even if they don't have direct, interactions with folks, they just know that that is out there in existence. And I think that's very, very beneficial for folks within sex therapy and sex education to keep in mind, to send those messages out into the universe so people can pick it up when they need to hear it.
Yeah, absolutely. We're excited to have anybody enjoying the show, learning from it. I mean, spreading the good word. But the thing that gets me excited and that has me, come into the studio every week are those phone calls that we get when people are telling us, hey, I'm in the bathroom right now. My girlfriend can't hear the question I'm about to ask you. Or, I'm hiding in the basement if my parents only knew, and those sorts of things. So we're incredibly thankful that you came and kind of shared some of this with us. For everybody in the bathroom, in the basement, everybody who is listening to the podcast as they jog through the park or as they drive to work, everything else, and just helping us, I guess, sort of create a little piece of that more sex-positive, better world that we're looking towards.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's great. What you're doing is fantastic. Like I was saying, there's no right way to do this. Everybody has their own part and their own role. It's just figuring out what your skill set is and what you're comfortable with, and kind of fighting your own fight, which you're definitely doing. So I appreciate you. I appreciate this channel, and I definitely appreciate being invited on here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, please keep being the lightning rod for us on the other side of things, and we'd love to have you back. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Take care.